Hi, this is Eternal King here, bringing you another LOR video today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about deck building, right? And how to build a deck in the Eternal format that is designed to last forever. My approach to Eternal as a format and Legends of Runeterra as a card game at this point in its life cycle is that I want any deck that I truly throw my weight behind to essentially have a forever life cycle. That's essentially where I'm at with it right now. So I'll give you an example. Obviously, Majin Bey was exceptionally good at this. He would build a deck like Swain Nora. Swain Nora with Majin Bey's ratioing is a forever deck. Again, I literally have this here. We can look at it. This deck is gonna last forever due to a certain number of fundamental inclusions that I'm gonna go over in this video. So again, Flocks, right? Flock is an exceptionally good card, and Flock happens to pair very well with Pings. So the natural inclusion of Pings plus Flock make this deck stable and have long-term appeal. And then of course Disintegrate as well, being your other pre-Flock style card, where you stick it on the stack prior to the ping. But they're serving similar purposes here. So essentially any deck that is the best at capitalizing off of Flock and capitalizing off of Disintegrate is going to be the best iteration of that deck. It is going to be a forever deck in Eternal. So obviously Nora being a good pairing with Flock and Disintegrate, because Nora generates portals, which is basically just a bunch of junk units that you can use to damage the opponent's creatures. Scorched Earth being another death enabler or a landmark removal. Landmark removal being a very smart long-term consideration for the Eternal format. Wall Up being a stun. There are specific times in this deck where you need to stun something. Specifically, I would think like a large Overwhelm unit or a combo, like a Rise being a combo unit, who could OTK you. So there are times when you have to stun something in this deck. Then you have the one counter spell, and the rest is just like pure Swain top end. It's pure Swain Nora top end, Portalpalooza, Swain, Enraged Firespitter to ping and drag something, and then Swain Boat for the win con. So this is essentially a forever deck because there are very few things you could do to make this deck better in terms of meta considerations. There are micro inclusions, like at this point in the game, with the popularity of something like Temple, you might make the hard call on the third Scorched Earth, and like that's not going to be wrong. You might make the call that you don't need the counterspell right now because the meta, is not great in terms of counterspells. But like those aren't real changes to the deck fundamentally. It is better just to keep the deck the way it is, with its exact ratioing, and it's going to be good regardless of what the opponent is trying to do, because it's simply perfectly ratioed and it's the perfect iteration of that deck. Similarly, when I was looking at Majin Bey's Rise list, I had thought that it was far too chumper heavy, so there was just too much of this stuff, and that thanks to some balance changes like patches and card inclusions, that I could move away from being as chumper heavy, and that would be the perfect iteration of that Rise deck, and that turned out to be true, just objectively speaking. So for example, Jury Rig, he would be on Jury Rig, and I was just like, that card doesn't need to be in this deck. Not now that we have things like Steel Gale and more sustainable long-term healing for the deck and more stall and things like that, and that turned out to be true. So this is the quote-unquote perfect iteration of a Rise deck. Whether you want to be on the newest version that I have with Gruesome Theater, or you prefer the old school 2-mana stun, it's really up to you. I would say that the stun is more universally good, but I really like Gruesome Theater for like top end anti-tempo smart plays, because the way that I like to spend my mana efficiently is I like to pass turn 1, Gruesome Theater, they're 2-drop on turn 2, and then turn 3 I have 4 mana, so I can establish a landmark And that turns out to be perfect tempo for a Rise deck in this shell. Like, that's perfect anti-tempo. You can't get a better anti-tempo curve than bouncing their 2-drop, their high-value 2-drop, and then establishing a landmark immediately afterwards. There is no better play in Rise. And then once you've anti-tempoed perfectly in terms of Gruesome Theater, their 2-drop, and then establish a landmark on 3, the rest of the game you're going to be stalled out and bouncing and stunning, and you'll be fine at that point. You'll basically have won. So that was the perfect iteration of a Rise deck, whether it is the 2-mana stun version or the 2-mana bounce version. They're doing similar things. One is just, I guess they would say they'd prefer it. It's a preference thing. It's a preference thing. I like the bounce heavier version. Other people like the stun heavier version. It doesn't change much. But yeah, those are forever decks, right? Rise is a forever deck because it does some things exceptionally well. The thing that it does exceptionally well in this case is establish a win con that has 0 creatures in it, right? Rise being the only creature, he comes down with Spell Shield, he's hard to remove, but everything else is just landmarks. There is no deck in the game that can win just off of landmark value other than Rise. And not just at one landmark, it's actually a wide landmark board, which makes it harder to deal with. And then obviously ramp. What is the ultimate ramp deck? What is the ultimate iteration of a ramp deck? Well, we know it's not Eddy ramp because Eddy Demacia exists and it's just better. So that's the ultimate Eddy deck. So typically the best Freljord deck is going to be some iteration of ramp that is not reliant on creature-based win cons, right? It's a little more teched into ramp win cons, like actual ramp win cons, responsive win cons, things like Bird and Ice, Swiftfoot, She Who Wanders, Field of Rush. This is going to be overall better than trying to force a creature spam shell into a ramp shell when Demacia just does it better. Like Mobilize plus Cloud Drake into blah, card vomit hand. Is going to be better than the Freljord Mana Crystal version. The main thing that the Mana Crystal version has going for it is that you're able to save spell mana efficiently, right, for board wipes. That's the one nice thing about ramp shells, is that it tends to generate Mana Crystals very efficiently, which translates well into spell mana. So yeah, it makes sense that the ultimate quote-unquote ramp shell would be one that is more teched into responding to what your opponent is doing. And of course, back on the landmark value again, because landmark removal is a hard tech choice that not everybody is running. So Heart of the Tree can also get value. And then when I came into Azir Aurelia, when I built that 5 months ago, before it was picked up by Sunny and called one of the best decks in the game, when I first kind of figured out Emperor's Army as a deck, I was thinking that having a way to essentially establish value in an Azir Aurelia deck that was not creature-based would also be potentially one of the strongest things they could do. And yeah, again, it is the highest play rate deck, Azir Aurelia, whether it is the Emp Army version or the old school version. It really is a matter of percentage degrees. Obviously, the Emp Army has certain things going for it in terms of a combo win con, and then the responsive spell version with more bounces and things like that has certain things going for it as well. But yeah, I had built the Emperor Army Azir Aurelia deck to be, quote-unquote, the ultimate version or the best version in the game in certain respects, and then in every case, my decks are lasting the test of time. Now, Sunny made some changes to the original list that I think made the deck slightly more aggressive, but also slightly more fragile. And now his version of the deck, which was my deck, has now been expunged from the stats. Because, again, a lot of streamers, a lot of popular players, they think too short-term. They think exactly what's going to work for ladder, and that's second. And then it doesn't last. So yeah, now my Emperor Army version that he took is no longer available in terms of deck tracking. Because, it was proven to be, it just got usurped by someone else by a percentage degree. It's the wrong way to look at deck building in Eternal. You want to look at deck building so it's like this version of the archetype is going to last forever. So I do still believe that there is a version of Emp Army that is going to last forever. And I could prove that by playing the games myself. which is something I might have to do. Essentially just grind out losses until I find that like perfect ratioing for the deck of Emp Army that is going to win every game. But it does exist. It absolutely exists. It's going to take some very careful ratioing and figuring out what that is. But there is a perfect Azir Aurelia deck with Emp Army, 100%. And then, basically you're seeing a slight difference there between like the way that Sunny approaches meta decks and the way that I approach Eternal decks, where like my Rise deck will be recorded forever in stats in terms of the best Rise deck, and then the Emp Army version that he stole from me is now gone. It lasted about a week, right? It's like a flash in the pan and then it's gone. It's the wrong way to look at deck building, because you want to be building the ultimate version of an archetype at this point in the game's life cycle that will last forever, like Majin base Swain Nora, right? Swain Nora will last forever because he built it perfect. He built it perfect, and he built it to be flexible and not to be fragile. And so, yeah, same thing with ramp, same thing with combo-based win cons, and that's the way I'm going to approach pretty much all of my decks going forward, and it seems to be going well. So for example, PNZ Burn Shadow Isles is a deck that has fallen off of popularity, but at a certain point in the Eternal life cycle, it actually was the top win rate deck in the game. So if I was able to grind out a version of Teemo Elise Shadow Isles Burn that did not lose because it was perfectly ratioed and teched into everything, that would be very valuable. That could be a forever deck right there. That could be a forever meta deck in Eternal if you could just win with Elise Shadow Isles Burn. Essentially I would argue, 80% of games, right? 70% of games, 60% of games. It doesn't really matter. Whatever the best version of the archetype is, 60% is fine. That's what Azir Aurelia gets. But yeah, whatever the ultimate version of this archetype is, that's the one you should build. And so what's the alternative to that? Well, the alternative is sniping, right? You're just thinking like, oh, I really want to win this one game, so I'm going to run this deck, and then I'm going to include all these tech options to beat that one deck, and then it's only going to win this one game. The reality is that in the long-term approach of LOR, we're not getting any more expansions. We're not getting any more card changes. So short-term wins don't really matter anymore in the Eternal format. It's similar to Modern and MTG, where like whatever you build just has to be the best version of that archetype and just has to last forever. So Hecarim is a great example, right? So Hecarim currently does not have a meta deck in Eternal. So if there was a version of Hecarim that would be the best version of the deck in the game, I would assume that it would probably be on the story, right? It'd probably be like an Iron Conquest deck with, and we're going to do like a live build here. It would be with Sharks, right? So Shark, Chariot. Right, so it's very much a Shark Chariot combo deck, just as like your basic shell in terms of like what you're trying to do with your Hecarim deck. And then I have seen versions of Iron Conquest, Hecarim that like to run a little bit of the Azir Aurelia package because it is just like universally good sometimes. So they might run Sparring Student, Shadow Apprentice, and then the 2 mana card as well, because you're just pulling so many gosh darn sharks, right? But another way to go at it, that's a little less fragile potentially, is that you go Gwen, right? Like you could go Gwen, and that allows you to hedge value a bit more in the deck. So like that's 2 different approaches, and you have to test those and figure out which one is winning. And there's no way to cheat that, right? Like you're not trying to target someone in particular. You're not trying to make anyone look bad. You're just literally deck testing. And you're just putting out the raw stats of like, this works. And I can prove that this works in an objective manner, right? So maybe you go here, and then you're on Gwen. And at the end of the day, your Shark Chariots are going to be representing a lot of consistent threat value. But yeah, you could do Gwen, and then you're going to want the Rally. So Rally. I think they changed it to 6 mana. Yeah, Dragon Ambush. So I would just be on like the 6 mana Dragon Ambush. with, the Gwen package. Obviously, it was nerfed from 5 mana to 6 because it was an overtuned card. That being said, I still think you just run it. It's good enough. But yeah, and so you would have to decide: do you want the Gwen slow value version, right? And then you could do more landmark value and more combo focused stuff if you wanted to. If you saw that there was like legitimate value in that, you could hedge more into landmarks with the likes of Black Flame, or of course the Gwen landmark as well, which generates an attack token each turn, which would be great for sharks. So Oppie and Foyer would generate something to pull your sharks every turn, and then maybe you're like hardcore sharks and you're like Faded Memories, right? And you're like Faded Memories the shark, and you Iron Conquest the shark, and you Opulent Foyer to pull out sharks, and like it's a shark deck, right? Like that's what you're doing. You're doing the shark thing. And if you're not doing the shark thing, you're playing just like dumb creatures you don't care that die because they're cycling in power for your sharks. And then eventually your dragon ambushes and stuff like that. So again, I can't say that this is the definitive best version of the deck. You would have to test it. You'd have to test the Gwen version versus the slightly more aggressive version that's using the Azir Aurelia creature package. They will both have their own, advantages and disadvantages. One cycles in power in the deck, and then one is more powerful straight up front, but then doesn't cycle in any power if it gets answered. So this is basically my mindset in terms of this deck building tutorial. Is just like, okay, we have an idea. What is the best version of the idea? Not what is going to win right now, not what is going to beat the person that I'm facing off against, not what is going to snipe the best for certain for modern ladder conditions, because again, nobody really cares about climbing anymore. Like you think about, like, everyone's been to Masters, everyone's been to top 100 Masters. Climb grinding in the long term span of LOR doesn't matter anymore now that the tournaments don't exist, and now that a lot of the competitive people have left the game. It's just not like a valid way of thinking about deck building anymore, because again, beating someone else is fun in a competitive game. Don't get me wrong, you play Counter-Strike, you click on the other person's head first, that's great. But when it comes to modern deck building in MTG or eternal deck building in LOR, you're mostly thinking of what's going to last the test of time, right? Tron lands in Magic the Gathering. It's like you play 3 lands that generate a ton of mana, and then that's just like existed in MTG forever. And my decks are the same way. My Rise will last forever. I think my Imp army would have if it wasn't like popularized and kind of semi-stolen by someone else before it was at the ultimate version of itself. That was a bad choice. But I'm also not going to grind out stats to try to force the Imp army back, into the top of the spotlight, when that's what should have happened in the first place. And then obviously ramp as well, where I want the ultimate version of like Freljord Ionia ramp. But that's kind of it in terms of like a deck building instruction guide of like you really just have to think, what is the ultimate version of an archetype? And this goes for every single deck. Like, what is that deep deck that you're 100% sure that you can put out stats with, right? Like, that's literally the only thing that matters, is like, you're playing Nautilus, you're playing a deep deck, or you're just playing Maokai in a mill shell. That's it, right? Like, what is the version of that deck that I can run for the next 5 years in LOR? That's all I really want to know. Because I haven't found it yet, but someone else might find it. And I need to see the numbers to support that if I'm going to play and trust your deck. Because otherwise, it's just a brew or a meme or a temporary ladder deck built by a streamer that wasn't thinking long term. And like, that's not really useful to me, and it's not useful for LOR as like an eternal format. For the most part, it's not. It's great to draw attention to brews, and it's great to draw attention to certain archetypes, but it's less interesting when it doesn't last more than a week, in my opinion. Give me that Kennen deck that I can run for the next 5 years. Like, I want to see that. Give me that Ahiri deck that I can run for the next 5 years. I want to see that. That Zoe deck, right? That Diana deck. That Jax. Where did Jax go? Like, why is Jax just gone now? I can't personally create the forever version of every single archetype, because it's actually very hard in Eternal to do that. In fact, I would argue there's pretty much, there was Majin Bay, and then you have these like Eddie decks, and then you have these Temple decks that are arguably very much the ultimate version of themselves. But then you have a lot of other lists that are just like flash in the pans and nobody cares. I'm far more interested in prosperity deck building, right? Like just like things that just work and continue to work and will never stop working. I think that in terms of the long-term health of LOR as a card game and the Eternal format, that's a lot more interesting to me. That's it for today. Just like a quick deck building guide and instruction of like the kinds of things you want to be thinking about when you're building a deck. Is that like, is it Sparring Student and, Shadow Apprentice? Or is it, Gwen package? Typically, you're going to have to pick one. And then you have to test those two versions against one another to see. Obviously, you'll know. Like, typically, when you find the right mix, you'll just start winning nonstop in Eternal. Like, that's how it is. It's very feast or famine. Like, either you're just like, okay, this isn't going to work. Or you're like, oh, I got it, right? And you know right away because you've hit that mark of just like, okay, this is just going to win without competition. But you have to do the testing, and you have to know and have that sense of like, okay, this is going to work forever. And I think only some of the best players in the game have that. Like, if you were to ask Majin Bay, like, why is Swain Nora still playable like a year after you built it? And he might not necessarily know the exact answer other than to say, I built this to be okay into everything. And that's how I always built my decks. And he did. And it is. And it always will be. This is Eternal King, signing out.